Born into Dudith Castle, bells rang before dawn, their heavy toll echoing across stone walls and winding village paths outside the fortress gates. Peasants barely lifted their heads from the morning labor, for the sound of bells did not often concern them. It was the world of lords and kings. But inside those walls, the world shifted. A child had been born in the royal chamber, not just any child, but a princess. The midwives whispered prayers as they wrapped the tiny infant in cloth, woven with golden thread. The queen, pale and trembling from the long hours of labor, barely had time to look upon her daughter's face before the court attendants swept in. The chamber was no longer hers. It belonged to politics, to the kingdom. Two men with scrolls and seals. The king entered, his footsteps sharp against the floor. His eyes fell on the child, and for a moment, silence lingered. Not a son, not the heir he had wished for. The disappointment did not pass unnoticed, even as the princess wailed. Her first cries, her worth was being measured against the expectations of power. Yet, she was not without value. Whispers ran through the room as advisors murmured names of foreign princes and dukes. She will make a final alliance, one said. Spain, perhaps, or France. Before the child even opened her eyes, her life had already been decided. She was not born for herself. She was born for treaties, for bonds, for sacrifices. Her mother reached out weakly, pulling her close, whispering soft lullabies of comfort. But even the queen knew her daughter's path was not her own. In the harsh reality of medieval courts, daughters were chess pieces on the board of politics. Their births were celebrated with feasts not for joy, but for opportunity. As she grew into her early years, the princess was surrounded not by toys and freedom, but by rules and expectations. At the age of 3, she was taught to bow properly, low enough to show respect, graceful enough to display her breeding. By 4, she was given her first embroidery needle. The stitches she made were not mere practice, but symbols of her patience, her discipline, her ability to master the skills of womanhood. By 5, she could recite prayers in Latin with flawless precision. Though she had little understanding of the words she spoke, her days followed a rigid pattern. Morning prayers at the chapel, lessons in language and scripture, and hours of practice in the feminine arts. She was not permitted to run through the halls shouting like other children. Laughter was considered unseemly if too loud. Every action was watched, every gesture corrected. A princess, she was told, was not just a girl. She was the face of her family's honor. Servants whispered of the world beyond the walls, the bustling markets, the farmers tending fields, the smell of bread baking in cottages. But these were distant dreams. She was confined to her chambers, her gardens, her tutor's presence. Her childhood, though wrapped in silk, was a cage of expectations, and yet there were moments of rebellion, small sparks of the child that lived beneath the crown. Sometimes she would sneak away into the royal gardens, barefoot, feeling the cool grass beneath her feet. She would laugh freely there, spinning in circles until the stars blurred above her, only to be scolded when discovered. Her governess would grab her arm, whispering sternly, "You are not a farmer's daughter. You are a princess. Never forget what you are." But deep inside, the princess longed to forget. She longed to be ordinary, to play with other children, to chase geese in the courtyard, to eat honey cakes without fear of staining her gown. In the fairy tales told by her nursemaids, princesses were always happy, blessed by fairies, rescued by knights, living lives of wonder. But even as a child, she began to see the truth those stories were lies. At 7, her world grew smaller still. Lessons in etiquette consumed her hours. She learned to walk with measured grace, balancing books on her head until her back ached. She was taught to speak only when spoken to lower her eyes in humility, and to never, ever contradict a man of highest station. Her tutors told her that silence was a woman's greatest jewel, that patience was her crown. She learned quickly, for mistakes brought sharp reprimands and sometimes harsher punishments. She envied the pages and squires who trained in swordplay in the courtyard. Their shouts and laughter drifted into her chambers as she stitched in silence. She once asked why she could not train with them. The answer was swift. A princess does not wield a sword. She wields her beauty, her grace, her womb. That is her weapon, and it is more powerful than steel. The words stayed with her. Even as a child, they made her feel heavy, like chains had been draped around her shoulders. She was not free to dream of adventures or greatness. Her destiny was already written. She was to be a bride, a prize, an instrument of alliance. But within her heart, there grew a quiet flame. Though she was bound by duty, she carried questions no tutor could silence. Why should she not have a voice? Why should she be caged when others roamed free? Why should her worth be measured only by the power she brought to men? She could not yet answer these questions, but they shaped her as she grew, beneath the silks and jewels. Beneath the titles and duties, she was still a child who wanted to live, to laugh, to be more than what was written for her. This was the untold truth of her earliest years, that a medieval princess was not born into fairy tales, but into duty. And while others saw her as a jewel to be displayed, she quietly began to see herself as something else, a soul longing for freedom in a world that did not permit it. The golden Kajeti castle was her kingdom, or so it seemed. Its high towers pierced the sky, its walls stretched like arms of protection around her, and its courtyards bustled with servants and guards. To the villagers who gazed up at it from the valley, it was a place of majesty and wonder. To her, it was both palace and prison. By the age of 10, she already knew what freedom cost. She had never stepped foot in the village below, never tasted bread fresh from a baker's oven, never run through fields with other children. Her companions were chosen for her, daughters of noble families, sent to serve as her ladies-in-waiting. They played games together, but even these games were carefully watched by her governess. Their laughter had to remain soft, their gestures graceful, their behavior fitting of nobility. Every action of hers was studied. When she sat at the table, her posture was corrected with a tap on the shoulder. When she spoke too quickly, she was told to slow down and speak like a princess. Even her silence was measured. Was she too quiet, too shy, too bold? It seemed that nothing she did belonged to her alone. The castle itself reflected her life, magnificent but confining. Its walls kept enemies at bay, yet they also blocked the outside world. Through the narrow windows of her chamber, she often watched villagers walking the dirt roads, carrying baskets of grain or leading donkeys to market. They laughed without fear of who might be listening, argued loudly in the streets, sang songs. As they worked, she envied them for all their poverty. They possessed something she did not. Freedom. Inside, her world was carefully staged. The rooms she lived in were lined with tapestries, the floors covered with rugs, the tables filled with golden candlesticks. But beauty was not comfort. In winter, the stones froze cold and drafts seeped through every crack, no matter how many furs were piled on her bed. At night, she sometimes lay awake listening to the howl of wolves beyond the walls and wondered what it would be like to be among them, wild and unchained. Her governess reminded her constantly, "You are not like them. You are not free to live as you please. You are a princess. You carry your father's name in your every breath." These words were repeated so often that they etched themselves into her mind like scripture. Banquets were the only time she saw her father's court alive with noise and splendor. Long tables overflowed with roasted boar, honey-glazed apples, and golden chalices of wine. Minstrels played lively tunes, jugglers performed tricks, and nobles whispered gossip behind jeweled goblets. To the court, these banquets were moments of celebration. To her, they were tests. She was expected to sit perfectly still, smile politely, and laugh at the right moments. She could not eat too quickly or too little. She could not speak unless spoken to, and when she was spoken to, her words had to be graceful, intelligent, and yet humble. At just 10 years old, she already carried the weight of representing her family to every eye in the hall. Behind her veil of composure, she studied the adults. She noticed how her father's advisors argued over territories and dowries as if people were coins to be exchanged. She noticed how the queen kept her chin high, even when ignored by the men at the table, and slowly, she began to realize her own future would be shaped by these same calculations. She was a bargaining chip in a game of power, nothing more. Yet, in stolen moments, her true self emerged. On warm afternoons, she crept into the royal gardens where the roses climbed the walls in defiance of the stone. She would lift her skirts, drop her slippers, and run barefoot through the grass. Sometimes she sang to herself, sometimes she spun in dizzying circles until she collapsed laughing. For those brief moments, she was no princess, she was just a girl, but her freedom never lasted long. A lady-in-waiting or a guard would always find her, bringing stern reminders. You are being watched. What if someone of the court saw you like this? What would they think? Shame would be pressed upon her like a cloak, and she would return to her chambers, head bowed, her laughter fading into silence. The older she grew, the more suffocating the golden cage became. At 12, she began lessons in diplomacy. She practiced polite conversation, learned how to flatter without seeming false, and was told which families were allies and which were rivals. She discovered that every smile could be a weapon, every word a tool of politics. Even friendship was not simple. Each girl who sat beside her at lessons was also her competitor for favor, her potential rival in influence. Nights were the hardest. Alone in her chamber, she would gaze at the stars through the narrow slit of her window. She often wondered if, beyond those stars, there was a place where she could live differently, where she could choose her own destiny. But dreams were dangerous luxuries. She had already been warned that wishing for more than her role was selfish, even sinful, and yet the questions did not leave her. Why should she be denied the freedom to choose? Why should her life be measured by alliances and appearances? Why must she carry the burden of honor for a family that rarely saw her as a child? She had no answers, but she carried the questions with her, hidden deep inside like a secret rebellion. They became her silent comfort, her reminder that within the golden cage still lived a restless soul. Her childhood had ended before it began. By the time she was 13, the world saw her not as a child, but as a woman in training. But even then, she remained a prisoner of stone walls and expectations. To the world, she appeared blessed, clothed in silk, fed on delicacies, seated among nobles. But behind the glittering surface lay the truth. She lived in captivity, her every breath dictated by rules, her every step weighed down by duty. The castle was her golden cage, and though she smiled through its bars, she never stopped yearning for the world beyond them. The school of obedience. By the time she reached 13, the tone of her world shifted. The soft indulgence of childhood, if it could ever be called indulgence, was gone. The princess was no longer spoken to as a little girl. She was now addressed as my lady or the young mistress to the world of men and kingdoms. She was entering womanhood, and with it came a new set of lessons, harsher, sharper, and far less forgiving. Her education intensified. Each day began before sunrise with the toll of chapel bells, dragging her from sleep into icy stone corridors. After prayer, her tutors awaited her with scrolls and stern faces, Latin verses to be memorized, genealogies to be recited, long histories of kings and popes to be studied. Her days stretched endlessly, a march of books, psalms, and etiquette. But the most pressing subject now was not Latin or history, it was obedience. Her tutors drilled it into her with every breath. A princess must never question, never falter, never place her desires above her duty. Her body, her words, her silence, even her smile all belonged to others. She was told that her father's alliances rested upon her shoulders, that her husband's honor would one day depend on her virtue, that the strength of her children, yet unborn, would be measured by her discipline today. She felt herself suffocating beneath the weight of it all. Each lesson seemed designed to strip away the girl she had been. She learned how to walk so slowly and gracefully that her feet ached. She practiced eating with such measured bites that a single meal stretched into hours. She learned to lower her gaze when men addressed her, even when she burned with the desire to meet their eyes. And when she slipped, when she laughed too loudly, or questioned boldly, or showed too much eagerness, she was reminded of her place. A sharp word from her governess, a look of disapproval from her tutor, a whisper of shame in the corridors. The lesson was always the same. Her value lay in her silence, her restraint, her obedience. The boys of her father's court were trained differently. She saw them in the courtyard, swinging wooden swords and shouting with the joy of battle practice. They learned to ride horses, to hunt with falcons, to speak their minds in council. Their futures were to be leaders, warriors, kings. She, on the other hand, was confined to her chamber, where she practiced embroidering flowers she would never smell, birds she would never touch, castles she would never build. She envied the boys, their freedom to sweat, to shout, to act. She once dared to ask her governess why she could not train as they did. The answer came swiftly, sharp as steel. Your weapon is not the sword, child. It is your obedience, a woman's. Strength lies in her ability to bend, not to fight. That is how kingdoms are won. The words stung, but they sank deep. She began to understand what her life would be, not one of battles and glory, but of silence and sacrifice. At 14, the lessons grew more personal. Her governess began to speak of marriage not as a dream of love, but as a duty that would soon be demanded of her. She was told to perfect her manners, for she would soon live in another man's household. She was told to learn diplomacy, for her tongue would need to charm foreign courts. She was told to prepare her body, for it would soon be called upon to bear children. The thought made her stomach twist. She was barely a woman, and yet the shadow of her future already loomed. She wondered who her husband would be, a stranger, an old man with gray hair, a warrior scarred from battle. She wondered if he would be kind, or cruel, or indifferent. But these were not questions she could ask aloud. The only answer she was ever given was simple: you will marry who your father chooses. That is your honor, and your duty. Still, despite the heavy chains of expectation, the princess found small ways to resist. When she embroidered, she stitched not flowers, but strange, twisting patterns that her tutors could not interpret. When she read her psalms, she slipped in questions about the meaning of the words, forcing her tutors to admit what they themselves did not know. And at night, when she prayed, she did not ask for obedience, she asked for freedom, but such thoughts were dangerous. One evening, when she lingered along in the chapel after prayers, a priest noticed the intensity of her whispered words. He reported to her governess that she prayed passionately, willfully, as if she questioned the very role laid upon her. Her governess scolded her sharply, warning her that questioning one's duty was a sin, an insult to God himself. And so, the princess learned another lesson: her rebellion must be hidden. Outwardly, she nodded, smiled, obeyed. Inwardly, she built a secret garden of thoughts and questions that no one could touch. By 15, she had mastered the art of appearing perfect. Her tutors praised her composure. Her father's advisors commended her grace. Even her governess softened her stern tone, satisfied with the obedience she seemed to display to the world. She was becoming exactly what a princess should be: silent, beautiful, pliant. But within her, a storm brewed. For beneath the mask of obedience, the child who once ran barefoot in the garden still lived. She had been taught that her life was not her own, but she refused to fully believe it. Somewhere deep inside, she still dreamed of choosing her own path, of speaking her own words, of living a life that belonged to her. The school of obedience had taught her many things, but it had not broken her. Not yet. Marriage as a transaction. Winter frost had barely lifted when whispers began swirling through the castle halls. At first, they came softly hushed conversations between advisors, half-hidden letters carried by trembling messengers, but soon they grew louder, like the steady beating of drums. The princess, now 16, heard her future being spoken about in corners of chambers she was not allowed to enter. It was the season of negotiations. Her father, the king, sat for hours in his council chamber with ambassadors draped in foreign silks. Maps and scrolls spread across the great oak table, and the air grew heavy with talk of borders, treaties, and dowries. Beyond the thick doors, the princess could only imagine what was being said. She knew the truth. She was no longer merely a daughter. She was a bargaining chip, the most valuable piece her father could place on the board of power. She was summoned one evening to stand quietly at the far end of the chamber, while the men debated her fate. She had no seat at the table. Her presence was symbolic, not participatory. Her father gestured toward her as if she were an object displayed for trade. The ambassador, a stout man with rings glittering on every finger, appraised her with sharp eyes. He bowed politely, but his gaze lingered as though she were livestock at market. 16 years of age, her father said proudly, educated, obedient, and a pure bloodline. She will be a credit to your lord's house. The princess stood motionless, her stomach nodding. She was expected to look serene, graceful, untouched by fear. But inside, her thoughts screamed, who is this man they speak of? What kind of husband will he be? Will I be safe in his home? Her governess's words echoed in her mind. Your husband will be chosen for you. Love is not your path. Duty is. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparations. Her gowns were measured, her jewels selected, her dowry chest filled with gold and embroidered linens. Priests blessed the union, though she had not yet met the man who would become her husband. At night, she cried silently into her pillow, careful that her ladies-in-waiting did not hear. If they did, they would remind her that tears were unbecoming of a princess. The only comfort she found was in her mother, the queen, though rarely permitted to speak openly against the king's will, sat with her in private chambers, holding her hand in silence. One evening, the princess dared to whisper, "Did you choose father?" The queen's eyes softened with sorrow. "No, child," she replied, "but I learned to survive. And so will you." The wedding was a spectacle. The cathedral bells rang, their sound echoing through the valley. Nobles gathered in silken robes, their jewels catching the candlelight. The princess wore a gown of gold brocade so heavy it weighed upon her shoulders like armor. A veil covered her face, shielding her trembling lips from view. As she walked down the aisle, she felt the eyes of the kingdom upon her. They did not see her fear. They saw only a symbol: peace secured, wealth exchanged, a new alliance forged. Her father's head held high, proud of the prize he was giving away. At the altar stood her groom, a man twice her age with a stern face and eyes that revealed nothing. She had seen him only once before, across a banquet hall. Now he was to be her husband. His hand, heavy with rings, took hers in a grip that was firm, not tender. The vows were spoken, not in the language of love, but of permanence and obedience. The priest spoke of duty, fidelity, and divine order. No one asked the princess if she wished it. Her silence was her consent. The feast that followed was filled with laughter, music, and toasts to the union. Guests cheered as roasted meats and wine flowed freely, yet the princess, seated at the center of it all, felt invisible. Nobles spoke around her, not to her. Her husband accepted congratulations as if he had won a prize. She smiled as required, her cheeks aching from the effort. Inside, however, she mourned. The castle she had known since birth, the gardens where she once laughed barefoot, the stars she prayed to each night, all of it was no longer hers. She was to leave it behind, to be carried off to a foreign court where her language, her customs, her very identity might mean little. She was a stranger about to step into a stranger's world. That night, when the festivities ended, she sat alone in her new chambers. The heavy gown lay crumpled on the floor, her hair unpinned, her veil discarded. For the first time, the weight of what had happened pressed down on her fully. Her life was no longer hers. Her body belonged to her husband, her loyalty to his family, her future to the children she was expected to bear. All her years of training, the silence, the obedience, the perfection had led her here. She was no longer her father's daughter. She was a wife, a possession, a transaction completed. And yet, deep within her, a flame still burned, though her marriage sealed her fate in the eyes of the world. Her heart whispered otherwise. She thought of her secret prayers, her hidden rebellions, her longing for freedom. They had not died. They lived quietly inside her, waiting. Perhaps she could not choose her husband, nor her path, but she could choose how she endured it. She could choose to survive, to carve power out of silence, to shape destiny in ways her father never imagined. For while men believed she was a pawn, she had begun to see herself differently. Pawns, after all, were small and overlooked, but in the game of kingdoms, even pawns could reach the far end of the board and become something far greater. The weight of motherhood's wedding rings had hardly cooled upon her fingers before the whispers began again, this time, not of treaties and dowries, but of heirs. The princess, still little more than a girl at 16, quickly learned that her new household measured her value not by her learning, her grace, or her beauty, but by the life she could bring into the world. Her ladies whispered in corners. The court physician studied her with assessing eyes, and her husband's family watched her with a hunger that was not for her, but for the children she would bear. Sons, specifically sons who could carry forward the bloodline, inherit land, and secure the dynasty's power. Pregnancy is expectation, not choice. Each month that passed without a sign of swelling belly or morning sickness weighed upon her like a curse. Her husband's tone grew sharper. The servants exchanged glances when she entered, and letters arrived from her father's court with thinly veiled concern. It was not enough that she had been married. She had to produce. When at last, after months of dread and silent prayers, she missed her courses, the castle erupted in celebration. Bells rang, banquets were thrown, and her husband's family paraded her through the great hall as though she were already crowned a mother of kings. But the princess knew that the journey had only begun, and the road ahead was perilous. The terror of childbirth, pregnancy in the Middle Ages, was less miracle than gamble. Each child carried the risk of death, not just for the infant, but for the mother. She saw it in the eyes of her older ladies in waiting, some of whom bore scars of their own labors, and in the solemn hymns whispered by the midwives. Her body ached, her stomach swelled, and yet she was expected to move with elegance, to smile serenely as though she were not terrified with each passing day. She had been taught to pray for strength, but no prayer could soften the agony that awaited her. When her time came, she was led into the birthing chamber. A room heavy with incense and murmured chants. Midwives hovered like shadows, and her ladies clutched rosaries, whispering desperate prayers. The hours stretched into a blur of fire and pain. She screamed until her voice broke, gripping the sheets with bloodied nails, convinced that she would never again see the morning light. And when the child at last slipped into the world, silence fell. The midwives bent over the infant, searching for its cry, a boy, a frail cry, but a cry nonetheless. Relief swept through the chamber like wind through a storm. She had done her duty. She had survived this time, the endless cycle, but survival was not rest. Even as her body bled and her strength waned, she was expected to rise, to feed the child, to attend court functions with regal grace. Her belly was barely healed before the whispers began again. When will she conceive another? And so began the endless cycle, pregnancy after pregnancy, birth after birth, each one tearing away at her body and her spirit. Sometimes the child survived, sometimes not. Tiny coffins lined with velvet were carried quietly to chapels while the court pretended not to mourn to openly. The princess learned to grieve in silence. Her tears were not for herself, no one allowed that, but for the children she could not keep, for the fragile lives that slipped away like smoke in her arms. The judgment of others. If she bore sons, she was praised, lifted high as a blessed woman. If she bore daughters, the congratulations were polite, but cool, her worth subtly questioned. A string of daughters could condemn a woman to ridicule, whispers of barrenness, or worse replacement. Each time she looked at her newborn, her heart ached not only with love, but with fear. Will this child survive? Will this child be enough? Will my husband still see value in me if it is not a son? Her husband's eyes gave her no answers. He performed his duty, visiting her chamber when required, appearing beside her at feasts, but his affections, if he had any, were reserved for the legacy she could provide. Finding strength in fragility, and yet, within this crushing weight, the princess found a strange kind of strength. Motherhood was the one duty she could not fully mask behind silence or obedience. In the private hours, when no eyes watched her, she held her child close and allowed herself the love she had been denied elsewhere. She whispered songs, told stories, and kissed tiny foreheads with a tenderness that was entirely hers. For the first time, she felt a bond not demanded by politics or law, but given freely from her heart. Each child's son or daughter was hers in a way no treaty could take. They gave her purpose, and they gave her quiet defiance, for while the world saw her as merely a vessel for heirs, she saw herself as something more, the guardian of fragile lives, the keeper of innocence in a world of cruelty. The cost of survival, but the cost was high. With each pregnancy, her body weakened. She felt it in her bones, in the tremors of her hands, in the nights where sleep brought no rest. She knew that one day, childbirth might claim her as it had claimed so many women before her. She prepared for it quietly, writing prayers on scraps of parchment, leaving behind lullabies for children too young to remember her voice. And yet, she did not let fear consume her. If death was to come, it would come. But until then, she would endure. She would fight not with sword or shield, but with the only weapon she had ever truly been allowed her will to survive. The princess's life was no fairy tale, but within the weight of motherhood, she carved her own legacy. Her children might never know the depth of her sacrifices, the nights she cried silently, the mornings she rose with trembling legs, but history itself was shaped in the nursery, and her endurance became the thread that held kingdoms together. Legacy beyond the crowned years past, marked not by seasons, but by births, deaths, and the steady ticking of obligations. The princess, no longer a girl, but now a woman of many winters, had grown into her role with a grace born of necessity. Her face bore the soft lines of endurance, her hands the calluses of needlework and prayer beads, her heart the scars of loss, yet she remained steadfast. From the outside, her life still looked like a fairy tale. She wore gowns of velvet trimmed with pearls, sat upon gilded chairs during feasts, and walked through corridors lined with banners proclaiming her husband's victories. But to those who knew her story, to those who lived in her shadow, her truth was plain. She was the unseen pillar upon which the kingdom stood, the quiet power of influence, though. Her marriage had been forged as a transaction. The princess discovered that obedience and silence could be sharpened into subtler forms of power. When her husband sat in council, she listened quietly from behind curtains or at the edge of banquets, storing away details of alliances, rivalries, and weaknesses at night. When his pride was softened by wine or exhaustion, she would speak in. Careful words, never commands, never direct opposition, but suggestions disguised as gentle observations, a word here, a question there, until her ideas became his. It was dangerous, walking the knife's edge of influence, but she learned how to guide without appearing to lead in time. Her husband's court began to notice that matters she touched often turned in the family's favor. She could soothe feuds, calm proud nobles, and even bridge divides between rival houses with nothing but her diplomacy. She was no warrior, yet her battles were fought with patience, wit, and the steel of endurance. Children as mirrors of legacy, her children grew, each carrying a piece of her spirit. Her eldest son was groomed for kingship, but she quietly taught him not just the art of ruling, but the importance of compassion. She told him stories of peasants she had glimpsed from her windows, of the struggles of farmers and mothers whose lives were harsher than his own. She planted seeds of empathy in him, even as tutors filled his head with strategy and law. Her daughters, too, bore the weight of expectation, destined to become pawns in other men's games. Yet she whispered to them in private, "You are more than a dowry, remember your worth." She could not free them from the cycle, but she could give them the knowledge. She had once longed for the truth that their value lay not only in obedience, but in their endurance, in the fire they kept hidden within. Some of her children lived, some did not. Each loss carved another wound into her soul, but also another layer of resilience. She became both fortress and garden, unyielding to the world's cruelty, yet nurturing to the fragile lives entrusted to her. The passing of time eased. The years pressed on, her hair silvered and her hands stiffened. She watched as new brides entered the court, young girls, trembling behind veils. Just as she once had been, their fear mirrored hers, their fate bound by the same chains of duty. She pitied them, yet also admired them, for she knew that each would find, in her own way, the strength to endure. She thought often of her childhood, the golden cage of her father's castle, the lessons of obedience, the wedding she never chose. How strange it seemed, now, that so much of her life had been decided before she could even speak. Yet she no longer resented it with the same fire of her youth. Instead, she had learned to see herself not as a victim of fate, but as its quiet sculptor. She had bent under duty, but she had never broken. How history remembered her when ballads were sung in the great halls. They spoke of her husband's conquests, her son's diplomacy, the treaties signed, the battles won. Her name was rarely at the center. At most, she was remembered as a pious queen, a dutiful consort, a mother of heirs. But the truth was deeper. Behind every treaty her husband signed, her counsel had guided his pen. Behind every decision her son made, her teachings had shaped his heart. Behind every marriage her daughters endured, her whispered wisdom gave them strength. History, written by men, did not see her, but history, lived by those who knew her, could not exist without her. She was the invisible hand, the silent architect, the uncredited author of stability. Her final reflection in her final days, the princess now a queen. Though her title had always been secondary to her duty-spent hours by the chapel window, she no longer dreamed of running barefoot through gardens or of freedom in the village streets. Instead, she thought of survival, of the countless women like her who bore the same burdens without crown or title. She realized her legacy was not jewels or titles. It was resilience. It was endurance. It was the quiet truth that a woman, bound in silks or rags, could still shape the course of kingdoms through the strength of her spirit. And so, when she passed, her death was marked by bells and processions, by banners hung in mourning. To the world, it was the loss of a queen, but to those who had felt her presence, it was the loss of something far greater, a woman who had carried the unbearable weight of duty and, through it all, remained unbroken. Beyond the fairytale stories told of princesses and towers and maidens, rescued by knights were never her story. Her life was harder, lonelier, and far more real. And yet, it was precisely in its harshness that her greatness lay. For her truth was not one of glittering romance, but of quiet power. She had endured a childhood of confinement, a marriage without choice, the perils of motherhood, and the constant weight of expectation. Through it all, she shaped her world in ways no minstrel would ever sing, but in ways that mattered most. Her life was not the fairy tale you imagine. It was something stronger, truer, and infinitely more human.